Good to see each of you. Appreciate your presence. And if you didn't get a worksheet, I think some of the young men were back there handing them out. These will be given out every lesson. I've got 6 of them, one for each lesson. And we'll answer a couple of different questions as we go through our meeting here. You might have noticed, we've got a fellow back here at the back who's got some. If you don't have one, you might throw a hand up if you need a worksheet. If you don't want a worksheet, or if you got one and you don't like to use it, hey, look, just dispose of it as you exit this morning. That's perfectly fine. But we're going through apologetic material. There are questions that are facing whether or not we like it. They're facing our youth. They're facing each of us. And the Apostle Peter would write something like this in 1 Peter 3:15, "Sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to any man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." And so the Christian is under the obligation to be prepared for a defense of the gospel. So says Philippians chapter 1 and verse 17. We'll be taking a look at these kinds of questions. Lesson 1 will deal with, does God exist? Lesson 2 will deal with the question of miracles, and we'll set that up nicely. It's not just we're going to jump into it cold feet. The third thing, we'll talk about the transmission of the text. Do we have a text that is actually accurately transmitted from God to the apostles or the other writers, and then down to us in now the 21st century? Do we have a legitimate text? Then there's another question that we'll deal with on Monday night, and that is whether or not what we do have, even if it's been transmitted accurately, can we trust it? Is it reliable? Is it trustworthy? And then Tuesday night we'll talk about the resurrection of Christ, and we'll spend some time analyzing that. And then the last night Wednesday night, we'll talk about the atonement. Did Christ really offer atonement? So, our lesson this morning is on Did God Exist? You might have noticed that there's a book stand set up in the back. The book that's called Substantive Faith goes along with everything we're presenting here. If you want something developed in a little more detail, you can do one of two things. You can shoot me an email at drewleonard@live.com. You can find the email back there on the book stand. Or also you can purchase a copy of the book, Substantive Faith, and it develops a lot of this quite a bit further. Let's go ahead and take a look at our lesson this morning. This is, Does God Exist? Christopher Hitchens, and I don't know if any of you know who that is or not, but he was a major journalist for a number of newspapers and periodicals out of New York, said, here's what we argue. He is an atheist, was an atheist. He has now passed away. We argue quite simply that there's no plausible or convincing reason, certainly no evidential one, to believe that there is such an entity, God, and that all observable phenomena, including the cosmological ones to which I'm coming, are explicable without the hypothesis. Let me break that down for just a moment. He is saying that we can explain everything about our universe without the existence of God. Not quite sure that that holds, but that's his argument. The second thing, he said this also. There's no such thing, no such word, though there should be, as adeism, or as being an adeist. But if there was one, I would say that's what I was. I don't believe that we are here as the result of a design, or that by making the appropriate propitiations and adopting the appropriate postures and following the appropriate rituals, we can overcome death. I don't believe that, and for a priori reasons I don't. If there was such a force, which I cannot prove by definition that there was not, there's no such thing, I've got that in there twice it looks like, and now we're going back, I think we're going the wrong way. Or maybe well, there we go. It looks like it's right now. I don't know if something got duplicated there. If there was an entity that was responsible for the beginning of the cosmos, and that also happened to be busily engineering the very laborious production of life on our little planet, it still wouldn't prove that this entity cared about us. So he's basically admitting at this point, even if there were a God, how would you know that it's the right one that you're serving? How would you know that he even cares for you? Let's go further and read the rest of it. Answered prayers, cared what church we went to, or whether we went to one at all, cared who we had sex with, or in what position, or by what means, cared what we ate, or on what day, cared whether we lived or died. There's no reason at all why. It looks like something got dropped out there. This entity isn't, okay, it's just lagging. I'm having to get used to this, you see. This is new for me. The one back home is a little less fidgety, I suppose. This entity isn't completely indifferent to us. That you cannot get from deism to theism except by a series of extraordinarily generous to yourself assumptions. The deist has all his work still ahead of him to show that it leads to revelation to redemption, to salvation, or to suspensions of the natural order in which hitherto you'd be putting all your faith. That is a lot of verbiage, isn't it? A lot to take in. Let's break it down then and see the 2 points what he's saying when he gives us this extended quote. 2 things. The first one is this. He's saying that naturalism, we don't need an explanation from God. He's saying naturalism is sufficient to answer all questions that we might have about the universe. Look, folks, your kids are hearing this. In the public schools, they are hearing from scientists, they're hearing from their biologists, they're hearing from the culture, of course, that naturalism as a worldview, sheer atheism, is sufficient to answer all of the questions about the universe. That is Hitchens' point precisely. A second point that he's arguing is even if we grant the proposition that God does exist, we'd have to face the reality of which God? How do we know that the Christian God, as the world religions term him, Jehovah, Yahweh, how do we know that that God is the right God to believe in? And that's what this whole series is going to develop. We cannot do this in just one lesson. If I get done here in this 40-minute segment proving to you that God does exist, I still haven't told you the question. I haven't answered the question of which God exists and why do we believe in Christianity as set over against the other religions of the world. And so I've got a week's work ahead of me. And Wednesday night, hopefully, by the end of this series, you'll have a substantive faith in what we call the Christian God, why we believe what we believe. Let's move forward then and establish 4 arguments this morning as to why we ought to believe in God. The first one is this. There is what's called the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument, and that's your first blank. The cosmological argument says something like this. Whatever begins to exist has to have a first cause. Whatever begins to exist has to have a first cause. Now let's take a look at a couple of points that might support this. Why do you think that the cosmological argument, that if something begins to exist, there had to be a first cause, the universe does exist, therefore God was its first cause? How many of you think that's a good argument? Oh, I certainly do. But now the question comes up, why do you think it's a good argument? A couple of reasons. The first one being this. The universe is not eternal. The universe is just simply not eternal. In fact, to show of hands real quick, how many of you have heard the name Richard Dawkins? That's a pretty good number, We've got maybe 5 to 10 somewhere in there. He is probably the world's leading atheist of today. How many of you have heard the name? Regarded as a fascinating mind, a brilliant man. How many of you have heard the name Stephen Hawking? He's now dead. Okay, a number of us, more of us. These fellows were close colleagues for atheism. Even they admit that when surveying the universe, it was not eternal. In other words, it means that they've got to find a first cause then. Even if they were to admit that the universe is 15 billion years old, which is almost outside of our minds, maybe not, but almost, even if they were to say that the universe is 15 billion years old, the question would have to be asked, what existed before 15 billion and 1 years? Somebody or something, wouldn't you think? And this is where the question of mind or matter becomes rather significant or important. The fact of the matter is, even the world's leading atheists admit that the universe is not eternal, and therefore it did have a first cause. The next thing we need to observe is that the materials demand an origin. How many of us have heard that scientific law, that you don't get matter to just jump into existence? Matter cannot be created or destroyed, given natural laws, right? So we are already starting to see that there's a necessity, there's already then seen a necessity for some kind of supernatural being, somebody who can step into our world and impact it beyond what we would observe to be the natural phenomena. The fact that our universe exists, this is something I'll make as a point in our next lesson as well, the fact that our universe exists demands that there has to be a creator behind it. So we've got the cosmological argument, and then see, the Bible's answer is quite sensible on the point as well. We want to get this one. This is Psalm 33. This is Psalm 33, a couple of Old Testament texts, where God, by revelation, told to the Hebrews that He was the creator behind heavens and earth, the natural order of things. This is Psalm 33, and while you're turning over to that text, I might just remind us of what Genesis 1:1 says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I suppose that's a pretty good way to start out the Old Testament, to let us know that God is the one who creates heaven and earth. And this was all at the beginning of the natural order. Some being then, according to the Bible that is, steps into the world and enacts something on the world, on our dimension, that supersedes or transcends the natural order. Now, think about putting that over against. Put that over against the naturalistic explanation, whatever it may be. If you want to go for the Big Bang, you want to go for something like an iron sulfur theory, you want to go for something like a cosmic egg theory, these are all the things that the big hitters are telling us. Let me tell you, the Bible at the least, the Bible stands at least as sensible as that, if not much more sensible. How many of you think that it's much more sensible to find that there is a mind, a creator God, who exists outside of the natural order and can step in and supersede the laws of nature because he's the creator of them? That sounds much more plausible to me than anything just jumping into existence without explanation. So look at this in Psalm 33 then. And I know I go fast. Look, if you want to tell me later on that I'm moving much too quickly, please do tell me at the back. This is Psalm 33 though. Look at this in Psalm 33:6. He says it this way, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth, all their hosts." Drop down to 33:9, and it says, "He spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast." The psalmist, Moses in Genesis 1:1, you put all of that over against the naturalistic explanation, and let me just say this, friends, Moses and the psalmist don't come off too bad, do they? No, they don't. No, they don't. When we start hearing people tell us that the universe just jumped into existence or the Big Bang is the origin of the universe, the question that has to be asked then is, if the Big Bang had materials somehow embedded within it, where did those materials come from? Where did this entity come from? This is the question that's raised by the cosmological argument. If something begins to exist, and the universe did, then it had to have a first cause. The second reason, there are a couple of objections. Let me tell you two of these. The first one is, who created God? That's an objection that might be raised. We might deal with that at the end if we've got time. I've got a last slide with some other objections on it as well. And then another objection against the cosmological argument might have something to do with miracles. It'd be premature for me to talk about miracles at this point. We'll spend the Sunday AM sermon here in just a moment talking about that question. It demands more than just a 5-minute explanation. Number two then, let's talk about the teleological argument. The teleological argument in essence is this. Design demands a designer. Now, I'll establish that at some length here in just a moment, but you can observe design in our world. How many times do you see intricate design and there's not a mind behind the design? Look, folks, we do this in nearly everything. How many of you like theater? How many of you like music? How many of you are really big art enthusiasts? A number of us. How many of you are contractors or work in construction? Okay, nobody, so I bombed on that one. Look, we see the design in our world. We see the design in our world. We don't walk into an art gallery and look at this brilliant painting and say something like, "Oh, I love that painting. It just jumped onto the canvas there." We appreciate the design behind it. And that's a point we'll make here in just a moment. This argument is supported. The teleological argument, design demands a designer, is supported by a couple of different things. The first one is this: the only alternative would be pure, sheer chaos. If you reject the idea that there's a designer behind the design, I'm sure that we'd have to agree that the result would be sheer chaos. You wouldn't have anything like order to the world. What you would have is just a chaotic existence. The second thing that would support this is that the odds against it are impossible. I'm not going to give you a bunch of statistics. They're almost meaningless. But the big hitters that are on the conservative side of things give us, and even the atheists, let me tell you that is as well, even those who are of the atheistic skeptical persuasion, even they admit mathematically that it's something like 10 to the, and you can imagine what power comes after that. It's only one in that large of a number of a possibility. Well, I'll not grant that actually. If you never had the materials to begin with, you can't have a possibility even of this world jumping into existence. We still need the cosmological argument answered. Where did the materials come from? But let's grant now, for a hypothetical sake, that these materials did exist. What are the odds of these materials not life-breathing, just jumping themselves into some kind of order and organizing themselves in such a way that we now can say, oh, there's great design in the universe? It's impossible. It is simply impossible. And it still raises the question of where did the materials come from in the beginning. You can read either the skeptics or the conservatives on this point. It doesn't matter. They all agree. Scientifically, the odds are simply impossible. C, and that's where Dawkins and Hawking and some of the others just go ahead and say, well, that's the miracle about it all. Here's a miracle without God, and this did happen. One person said, and I'm not sure I disagree with him, it takes more faith to be an atheist. C, examples support it. And I was using faith there in a very non-noble way, I suppose. C, 2C, examples support it. Anybody here work in the scientific department, in any kind of like scientific department? Okay, maybe not. How many of you know what DNA is? That's a better question, I suppose, then. Okay, a number of us. Have you looked at the intricacy to things like DNA? I mean, think about, probably a hot topic here, but think about the people who put together these vaccines. I mean, whether the vaccine's a helpful thing or not is not a question I care to answer. The question I seek to answer is simply, the people who put these things together, don't you think they're brilliant folks? The fact that there is an intelligibility to the science behind these kinds of things suggests something about the intricacies of the structure. That this just came into existence is too much for us to stomach. Why, take a look at your Bible if you've got it open there. And look at this, just if you're still there in Psalm 33. We read 6, let's look at it again. It says, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made. Let's stop there. Does anybody here have a hard time, not necessarily even understanding that, but just reading it? Assuming you're an adult who's been taught to read, you can read that and it has some sense of intelligibility to it, doesn't it? There's something about mind over matter. I suppose it'd be almost convincing for us to believe that matter could just be arranged in a way that looks intelligible. But mind? The fact that you and I have rationality says something about our Creator behind us. You do not move. This is an impossibility. You cannot move from pure, mere material to now a high-functioning mind without having a Creator behind the entire enterprise. Let me state that one more time. Rationality doesn't jump from pure material. And that's the question that the scientists and the philosophers and the historians have been debating for years. But there is simply no explanation that fits the bill other than the fact that there is a God, and there is a mind then, God, who transcends our natural order. He's outside of it, and He can impact it in ways that perhaps we may not even fully comprehend. D, then, the Bible even supports it. Let's take a look at Hebrews 3:4. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4. And even if the Bible didn't, it's a good argument, but take a look at this in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4. It says something like this: every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. In a very simplistic way, that is the teleological argument. You can observe a house, you can see its design, and so it is with the world, so it is with God. The fact that there's design in the world says something about God's existence. This is Bible Class Hour. Any comments or questions at this point? If I'm unclear on a point or you've got something that you'd like to ask, just feel free to throw your hand up and that'd be perfectly fine. Okay, let's go into number 3 then. Point number 3, the moral argument. There is a quote-unquote Christian philosopher that I like to listen to quite frequently. His name is William Lane Craig, and he does a lot of lecturing around the country at universities, even secular universities, Notre Dame, which isn't a secular one, I'm aware, Harvard, some of these others. He's well-traveled. And he says that what he has found is that this argument is the one that grabs hold of our college kids the most. Most of us feel, that's not a good argument, our feelings can be misguided, but the fact of the matter is that it's an emotional appeal, and at the least it's a good one at that. It grabs hold of people. Why do you think that is? Because people feel, right or wrong, they feel this way, that there are things that are objectively right or objectively wrong. Even the most radical skeptics who say that they don't believe in this sort of thing, it's interesting when asked they believe in this sort of thing. They don't like the idea that there's a God who can tell them who they can and can't sleep with. The skeptics don't like that there's a God who can tell them, you can't be a liar. You've got to be committed to truth-telling. They don't like the idea that there's a God who can tell them that they need to worship perhaps on the Lord's Day. And so our naturalistic world, and therefore our Western society that's being tugged at by the forces of naturalism, are being told that there's nothing objectively right or wrong. There's nothing that's objectively right or wrong. The problem that comes in is when we bring up moral atrocities that happen to them. They start to reanalyze the question. What if your loved one were at home and you're at the store? You get the groceries, you get the eggs, you get the milk, get a loaf of bread, and you've got dinner plans, maybe to do some French toast and some bacon and eggs or something that night, and you're on your way back home to find your loved one tied up, raped, and strangled to death. Nothing objectively right or wrong at this point. This is something that even the atheist can't stomach, folks. It speaks to our college kids. It speaks to you and me even as older adults, if we're older than that. It even speaks to us by saying, there's something that is wrong about that. To think that there are people out there that do these sorts of crimes and just get away with it is too much for the human being to stomach, don't you think? There is something about morality that speaks to us then that there has to be an objective moral lawgiver. If there is an objective right or wrong, there has to be a mind, a person, beyond naturalism that gets to call the shots and to say this is objectively right or wrong. Let's see what else we've got behind this. The alternative is pure subjectivism. Only opinionated, non-objective ethics. The judge, I'm told, following World War II, who put some of the Nazis on trial, held them accountable for their crimes. And the Nazis said something like this. They said, well, we weren't violating any law. And the judge got to thinking about that and said something like this. There's a law that transcends pure man. What is he talking about? Look, folks, if you don't have God, listen to where our ethics go. Listen to where morals go. You've got things like civil law, international law, but nothing that would actually warrant such a crime as being objectively wrong. If there were a panel of international fellows who put together some kind of list of all of the things in our world that are right or wrong, I would still be able to look at that and say, that's their opinion. Wouldn't you think? But if there's a being that's higher than each of us, we're giving him a term called God, then he gets to call shots as being objectively right or wrong. The biblical claim, then, is that there is a view of what's called transcendentalism. That word's not going to be found in Acts 17, but we want to spend at least just a moment looking at this. This is Acts chapter 17. Paul goes into a city. It is Athens. And he marches up to this place called Mars Hill or something like that. And in Acts chapter 17, he walks into this place and it says that he found this inscription on one of the statues. saying, to the unknown God. Acts 17 and verse 23. And it says in Acts 17:23, therefore what you worship in ignorance, Paul told the group there, this I proclaim to you. Verse 24 of Acts 17 says, the God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Nor, verse 25, is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he, verse 26, made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. This is Acts 17:28. For in him, God, we live and move and exist, as even some of your own Greek poets have said, we are also his children. This is Acts 17:29. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. And in light of what he's just argued, he says in Acts 17:30, therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. Let's work with this for just a moment and see what Paul is making as an argument in Acts 17:22 through 31. He is making a claim that the God that you and I serve exists somehow outside of the natural order. If this is the natural order, God is above and beyond whatever it is. He is the mind that stands behind all of this. So, look at some of this again. He makes the argument 17:24 and 25. He's not the sort of fellow that is served by human hands as if he needs our support. He's not the sort of fellow that made all of this out of pre-existing materials. The God that we say exists is the God who speaks it into existence. And furthermore, and this is something we're going to have to establish in the lessons that come next, he says that this God that we serve has done all of this through the man, Jesus Christ. And he says in 17:30 and 31, in light of this character's existence, there is coming a day, 17:30 and 31, where God is going to hold people accountable for moral rights and moral wrongs. There are people at our universities right now who may not like the idea of God, but the moral argument is too much for them to simply dodge. It speaks to our hearts. It speaks to the human condition. Try telling somebody about evil, pain, and suffering, and tell them about the senselessness of it all, and then tell them that the people who commit such crimes will just, perhaps in some cases, get away with it scot-free. This is too much in a lot of cases for us to stomach. And then see, we've kind of made this argument somewhat under the teleological argument, and that is that rationality, mind, that is, implies God. I might have some more for us on that point in our next segment on miracles. Okay, a few objections then might be these. God is guilty of atrocities himself. That really needs some wrangling with. Let me just go ahead and give you a counter-argument that's not nearly sufficient, not nearly exhaustive, but let me at least say something. If there's no moral lawgiver, then God cannot be guilty of violating objective moral wrongs. Let me say that one more time. If there's no objective law to violate, since there's no objective moral lawgiver, God that would be, God can't be guilty of violating something. His character as laid out in the Holy Bible can't be guilty of violating something that the atheists are telling doesn't exist. If moral law doesn't exist, how could we violate it? That's a biblical point. This is 1 John 3:4. What is sin? It's a transgression of law. We'll talk about sin more in Lesson 6 this week. But the point is still true. The point is still clear that God can't be guilty of something if it doesn't even exist. Violating moral law, that is. There's another thing I need to tell you here, and that is I've done an essay. It's a little lengthy. It's somewhere like 12 or 15 pages. I run a website. It's called cadleonard.com. It's my personal website, and there is an essay on there. If you have trouble finding it, shoot me an email, drewleonard@live.com, where I seek to go through some of these Old Testament atrocities and try to make sense of how it can be that God can destroy innocent babies, perhaps, in the flood. How can God still be just by sending the destroyer in Exodus 12 to kill the firstborn? Exodus 12. How can God command His people to go in the Old Testament and exterminate entire peoples like the Canaanites or the Amalekites? I've done an essay. I don't have time to deal with it here, but I've done an essay on this sort of thing. You might find that enjoyable if you're having questions on this sort of thing. A second thing that we might point out is that some might object. Christopher Hitchens objected to God's moral argument and a moral argument for God's existence by saying that moral promptings are innate to the human being. Well, that's not much of an argument, is it? That's kind of what we're saying. But where did they come from? The fact that you and I feel that it's not right to just go around murdering folks is actually something I'm saying, and Acts 17, I think, is saying it as well. These moral promptings stem from our Creator, who's given us a mind to think all of this out, to feel this way. I think that's actually an argument rather for God. And then number 4, we come to this idea of the resurrection of Jesus. This is an argument that often goes bypassed by the secular philosophers in trying to establish a case for the existence of God. But I think this is a wonderful argument, and in fact the text itself somewhat treats it this way. How do you know that God exists? Something like the resurrection of Jesus. Let's see if we can't establish 4 or 5 points here as to why then this is a good argument for the existence of God. This is the argument. Jesus resurrected from the dead, therefore God exists. Obviously, dead people don't just come back to life. If Jesus truly were dead, and He truly did come back to life, well then, that says something about there being supernatural forces that exist outside of the natural order, don't you think? Okay, let's see if we can establish a number of points that would support this, and we'll embellish a lot of this in more detail Tuesday evening when we talk about did Jesus really rise from the dead. The first point is this: the empty tomb is a reality. I'll establish that more when we come to Tuesday night. But the tomb was found empty. All of the gospel accounts are agreed on this point. So if taken as secular documents, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we treat them as 4 separate individual accounts, all writing about the same event, we have 4 independent testimonies verifying the same fact, which is the tomb was found empty. The second fact that we have that all of the Gospels account to is that there were post-resurrection witnesses. There were post-resurrection witnesses. I mean to say it like this then. After Jesus allegedly, at this point, we're just holding that in suspense, holding that in question. After Jesus allegedly came out of the tomb, there were people who experienced Him in the land of Palestine. Let's take a quick look at 1 Corinthians 15, just so we get some idea as to how many people experienced Jesus. So says Paul and the 4 Gospels and a number of others following His resurrection. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Let's begin around verse 3. He says in 15:3, I delivered also to you as first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. And in verse 4, He was buried, and He was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. Now he says in 15:5, after that He appeared to Cephas, Peter, then to the 12, Judas being dead, Matthias is the replacement. He's selected after. The 12 stands for the apostolic number. And then it says in verse 6, after that He also appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom even remain until now, but some of them have fallen asleep or died. And then he says in verses 7 and 8, then He appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, or born in due season, He appeared to me also. What is Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 8? Well, catch this, folks. Paul is writing this text, so say just about all of the scholars, somewhere around 55 or 56 AD. Why do you think Paul lists off, he appeared to Peter, the 12, the 500, James, and Paul also? Why do you think? Oh, we're up top. I'm looking around. See, we don't have a balcony where I preach. I thought he heard a voice out of heaven saying, "This is my beloved son." You know, some of these people were known. That's right. That is right. These are people, he says, some of them have fallen asleep, but some of them are still living. They're verifiable then. You can go check these fellas. Go talk to one of the 500 who are still alive and say, "Did you experience Christ after the resurrection?" And he says, "Yes." Well, that could just be one man's word. You say, "Let's go check another fella, don't you think?" You run off and ask this fella named, Jimmy. And Jimmy says, "That's how it happened." You start to tally up. You talk to 10 people now. You start to think, man, all of these stories lining up. Now you could say, well, maybe the 10 you talked to fabricated it. You know what doesn't make sense? That if it is a fabrication, and they're all in this together, creating some big lie, and this is the greatest deception that's ever came over humanity, you know what doesn't make sense? That the apostles who are allegedly engaged in fraud are now out on the front line preaching and dying for it. The fact that they said he resurrected, and we have a vast number of people who are still alive, and Paul says you can verify this with them, says something about the post-resurrection witnesses and the authenticity of the event, the historicity of the event. See, then, the non-Jewish notion of the rising. How many of the disciples prior to Christ coming out of the tomb believed that he would die and rise again? They were doubters. They still had that, what did he say, little faith? They were still of that sort. In fact, so much that in Matthew 16, Jesus Christ has Peter confess, "Oh, well, you are the Son of God." But then Christ says, "You know from the Old Testament Scriptures it's necessary that I suffer and die and then be raised again on the third day." And what does Peter tell him? "Oh, no, Lord. No. We'll fight them off." He says, "We'll never let it happen." And Jesus has to tell Peter, because this was actually God's divine plan, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan." He basically says, you don't know what you're talking about. The resurrection is a necessity. It's a necessity for the redemption of the world. The fact that none of the Jews accepted it, and then all of a sudden, Acts chapter 2, there's an explosion of the Lord's church. After all, you and I got here as being Christians somehow, didn't we? How do we explain the existence of the New Testament church? It goes back to the resurrection. If it didn't happen, how did it ever get off the ground? And so not only the non-Jewish nature of it, this was accepted by people who rejected the concept prior to the event. Something changed them. Something changed Peter and Andrew and James and John. Something happened, you see. And this leads us to D, something I was just hinting at, the outgrowth of the resurrection. What else could have caused these fellows, Jews, who rejected the resurrection as a concept, tried to somehow prevent Christ's death, what led them then to agreeing that it did happen, and that they not just said that it happened, but also took the heat and suffered and died in some cases for such a belief? The whole book of Acts is a testament to what happened following the resurrection of Christ. The New Testament church did exist, the apostles did preach it, and they did suffer and die. What does this say about Christ? It says something about a real resurrection. It says something then about God. So a few objections might be these. Somebody might object and say, well, I don't know that Christ's character and who he was actually warrants his rising out of the tomb. We need to talk about this in Lesson 5. Against miracles. Somebody would say, I don't believe in miracles. That couldn't have happened. I don't know the explanation, but it couldn't have happened. Let me see if I can deal with that a little bit more in our next segment. And then also again in Lesson 5 with Christ, did he rise from the grave? C, against the textual record or the history. So somebody could say, this would probably be where our culture right now, this is the argument I think they're making the most of. This isn't reliable, folks. That's what we're hearing. This is chock full of contradictions. It's not trustworthy. Matthew and Paul and the others were just simply writing propaganda. This is mythological. This is legendary. I think this is where our culture right now in 2022 is pretty well seated, which is why we're going to spend all tonight, Lesson 3 and then Lesson 4, talking about could we really trust this text, or is this something that was some fictitious fraud written by a couple of men who conspired? We'll reject that view and give extreme detail as to why tonight and then tomorrow night as well. Let's talk about some final matters. Who created God, and why isn't science all sufficient? Who created God? If I were to go back to the slide, you probably have it there on your worksheet. That first blank, the first argument for God's existence is the cosmological argument, which is stated as, these blanks are very important. Whatever begins to exist has to have a first cause. I'm arguing that God didn't begin to exist. He's eternal. He's always existed. So we're not dealing with material that had to be created. We're dealing with a being who is eternal in nature. We might use the word, he's a non-contingent being. He exists before and after. He's eternal. And so the text would even bear this out and say he's the first and the last, the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. That's Revelation 1, but it's a quotation of Isaiah 44:6, you see. So, does God have to have some kind of creator behind him, who then created him, who then created him? This is the wrong kind of loop, you see. God is a different sort of being. He's not material that began to exist. Objection 2. What about God in relation to evil, pain, and suffering? Look, I've got a little section in the book back there, Substantive Faith. I've got a little section somewhere around page 50 that seeks to deal with this kind of question in a very brief way. There's another book called Celebrating the Wrath of God by Jim McGuigan that if you're going through some evil, pain, or suffering yourself, you'd really want to check that out. If that was much too quick for you, talk to me afterwards, shoot me an email, something. I'll get you the material. You'll want to read that book if you're going through some things personally. Let me suggest a couple of reasons why evil, pain, and suffering might exist. Well, it maybe grabs our attention when God maybe hadn't had our attention. All over the Old Testament it talks about Israel finally turning back to God when they were maybe going through some evil, pain, and suffering. Psalm 119:71 says it this way, "It was good for me," David said, "that I was afflicted. That way I would learn your statutes." Sometimes evil, pain, and suffering points us back to God, especially if it's in a punishment kind of way. Another reason might be, why would evil, pain, and suffering be a reality? Because God's expecting you to be an example. He's actually investing in you to go through something, maybe as bad of a crime as it may be. He may be expecting you to go through evil, pain, and suffering so that other people might see Christ living in you. Job says this in 42:11. The narrator, not one of the friends, especially not one of the goons that were Job's friends, the narrator says that God was the one afflicting Job. 42:11, give it a read in your own time. God afflicted Job. Why? It was for a purpose. Why do you think Paul had that thorn in the flesh? To humble him, it said. But there's another thing. What do you think Paul would have said if God had said, Paul, we can do one of two things. We'll either take the thorn, whatever it may have been, and you'll have some kind of luxury in this life. Or better yet, Paul, we could leave the thorn, and because of that, somehow 5,000 will convert to Christ. What do you think Paul would have said? You and I know he would have said, I'll keep the thorn, right? Evil, pain, and suffering, we assume it's senseless, but maybe there's a third thing, and maybe that's that God is not only investing in us as a light in a dark world, but maybe there's a purpose in it, in that it teaches us that there's something about God and His purpose, His redemptive and holy purpose, that transcends our finite understanding. There's a movie, you may have seen this one. Anybody seen the movie Glory? I think it's an old Civil War movie. Nobody? Okay, well, I've not seen it either, so I'm in good company. I'm told that there was a little black fella in the movie, who had grown up with this other man. They were good friends, really good friends, their whole growing up. They get into the army, and this white man who achieves greater status among the ranks starts to treat his good buddy from childhood. 5 minutes or what? Time to stop? Oh, it's time to stop. Well, that's a really bad stopping point, don't you think? Okay, well, I've got a little segment in the book. Get a copy of the book and you can read the rest of that. Let's see if I can hit through real quick. What about deism? What makes Christianity the right religion? We'll establish that in the series this week. Final matters, here are the conclusions. 4 reasons why we think God exists. Number 1, cause and effect. It's the cosmological argument. Number 2, design demands a designer. That's your teleological argument. Number 3 is your moral argument. Number 4 is the resurrection of Christ. Hopefully we'll embellish some of this week. Thanks for being here. God bless each of you.